A wide-ranging racketeering case that accuses him of leading a scheme to overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia.
I want to give you a live look right now. This is outside the jail. This is the motorcade coming from the airport to that Fulton County Jail there in Atlanta. This is going to be the fourth time since April that the former president has turned himself in connection with a criminal case. It'll be the first time, though, that we could see a mugshot out of this. The Fulton County Sheriff has said that unless someone tells him differently, the jail is going to follow normal practices, and that means they'll release a booking photo of the former president. And just a short time ago, about 7 o'clock, we saw his plane land at the Atlanta airport. He flew in from Newark this afternoon after about a 2-hour flight. And there's Susie Wiles, who is from Florida, and she is a key leader in the former president's campaign to try and be reelected. But we caught up with the former president after he had left his club in Bedminster, New Jersey earlier today.
Mr. Trump faces 13 counts, including violating Georgia's Racketeering Act. The indictment, which includes 41 counts in all, was handed up a week and a half ago, following a 2.5-year investigation by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. The former president and his 18 co-defendants will be in court at a later date for their arraignments. That proceeding is expected to be held the week following Labor Day, and the judge will allow the arraignments to be televised. Like Florida, Georgia has cameras in the courtroom. That's unlike his first 3 arraignments, where television cameras were not allowed due to the rules in federal courts and in New York state courts.
And then the 19 charged could face trial within just a few months. A new motion filed today by the prosecutor suggests an October 23rd trial date. The former president has already made clear that he opposes that date. Last week, a March trial date was discussed. So also today, the former president replaced his lead attorney in the case. He has hired Atlanta area attorney Stephen Sado, whose website describes him as a special counsel for white-collar and high-profile defense. Joining us this evening is local attorney and former federal prosecutor Curtis Fallgetter. So, Curtis, what do you see as what's going to unfold tonight in Atlanta?
It'll be a standard booking process. He's already got the bond set, $200,000, which of course isn't too much for a gentleman who's got the wealth that the former president has. But it'll involve the booking photos, presumably, like they said. Fingerprints are typically taken. That process could take half hour to an hour. Secret Service will probably be with him because of the security issues there, and they'll let him go. The arraignment on these charges will take place at a later date.
And the mugshot will be made public.
They all have been, and I assume his will as well.
It's interesting, the sheriff has said, hey, we want to proceed here so that everybody gets the same treatment. And that same treatment, what we've seen in these other defendants who've been processed just in the last day or two, even some of them today, it's been a pretty quick process, 15, 30 minutes, something like that. Is that unusual or no? That's kind of standard as well.
When the bond is preset, the lawyers have negotiated with the prosecutor's office. When it's preset, and all you have to do is go and get booked, get a photograph, get the fingerprints, it's not going to take too long. And of course, I'm sure that those folks are going to do their best to get an ex-president in and out as quickly as possible.
What about the conditions that have been set for this bond?
Those are conditions that are preset also. Obviously, the monetary, that's already taken care of. There are some special conditions, though, that deal with his possible intimidation of co-defendants, witnesses, victims, and so there are bond restrictions that say he cannot do that, nor can you do it on social media, which of course we all know he's very fond of using social media. So in this case, unlike many of the others that have preceded it, the state judge up there has imposed those conditions, which we'll probably all have to monitor because, as we know, the ex-president is not terribly good about biting his tongue on social media. So we may well see some concerns there. If so, that could lead to a bond violation.
So folks, obviously in that right side of the screen there, we're monitoring the procession and then what's happening at the courthouse. And if we do have on-the-ground video we can show you, we'll do that as well. So Curtis, on that point, if a defendant, in this case the former president, doesn't follow through on some of those restrictions for being released or on bail or on bond, could a judge say, nope, we're going to revoke bond, you're going to sit in a jail cell?
Certainly could. Again, here's a man running for president. I'm going to assume that the Georgia judge is going to be as patient as possible on something like that, and if there's a violation, there's typically a show cause hearing that gets issued, and he'd have to come in and show cause if he's repentant, promise not to do it again. Who knows? It depends on the violation, of course. But generally speaking, I would think that judge would be as lenient as possible and give him some wiggle room, but not so much that he's, intimidating witnesses.
You know, he just issued a statement today on Truth Social. I think we have it. I can put it up on the screen. This is from 3 o'clock this afternoon. After making a reference to his recorded interview that aired last night, the former president said about the Republican debate, that's what they're referring to that. He said, quote, "But please excuse me," he had this interview last night, and then he said, "But please excuse me, I have to start getting ready to head down to Atlanta, Georgia, where murder and other violent crimes have reached levels never seen before, to get arrested by a radical left low-life district attorney, Fani Willis, for a perfect phone call and having the audacity to challenge a rigged and stolen election. The evidence is irrefutable. Arrest time 7:30 p.m. The phone call he refers to, of course, is by now very well known. It was in January 2021 when the former president, or he was still president at that time, of course, it was before the inauguration of President Biden. But Mr. Trump urged Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to, quote, find nearly 12,000 votes, enough to overturn his defeat in the state. You're not the judge here, Curtis, but that statement that Mr. Trump made this afternoon, does that sound like it could fly in the face of the restrictions of the bond?
Well, the restrictions deal with intimidating witnesses, victims, co-defendants. And Ms. Willis is the prosecutor, and so the bond conditions don't talk about insults to her.
So he can say what he wants about the prosecutor?
Within limits. And of course, prosecutors have to have thick skins, but no, that probably wouldn't violate the bond conditions. You can't tell a defendant to say nice things about your prosecutor. So
we're going to take a look here in just a moment at what's going on. We're tracking all of this process, including what's happening to reference the proceedings right now. So this is the web page for the Fulton County, jail, and this, we anticipate that either right now or very soon, like within seconds, it will show that former President Donald J. Trump has been arrested and has been surrendered. Here it is. It's coming up on your screen right there. So as we walk through this, we just referenced that phone call to the Secretary of State at the time back there in 2021, find me the votes. That's part of this case file here. That is part of the indictment that we're seeing, Curtis.
It's one of what they call a predicate acts. It's a RICO, Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations prosecution, which requires that they show an enterprise, which in this case is a group of individuals that have a common goal, in this case to overthrow the will of the voters in Georgia. That overarching theory is then based on some 161 predicate acts, which are all individually crimes under the laws of Georgia, such as trying to influence a public official, the call to Mr. Raffensperger, having improper access to computers that are there at the voting election offices, trying to intimidate witnesses, going to the state legislature and trying to get them to set aside the votes, getting fake electors. Those are all the main topics for the predicate acts, and then there's 161 of them with different members of that enterprise engaging in different activities to accomplish that common goal.
Fani Willis has said she'd like a trial date of October 23rd. The former president has already opposed that and is asking for a delay. One of the defendants has asked for a speedy trial. At least two of the defendants, I believe, have asked to have this moved to a federal court as opposed to a state court. With 19 different defendants, they're all kind of going in different directions. Does that make this awfully difficult to have this settled? I mean, it sounds like it could go on forever with different defendants having different strategies.
Well, Mr. Willis anticipated all that before this indictment was returned. There's 19 people. They're all going to come up with different strategies. They're all going to try to use that strategy to help each other out. For example, they did go to federal court. That federal judge says, no, I'm not taking the case away from the state courts.
So is that settled now? Is that done?
Not entirely settled, but the judge has refused to issue a temporary injunction. The judge will review it further, but right now it's still in state court. I think it'll stay there, Tom. Then, of course, you have strategies of some defendants now demand speedy trial. Why would they do that?
Jeez, bro.
They don't want a speedy trial. They just do that because they want to throw a monkey wrench and try to get their case severed from the other folks. And Mr. Trump has jumped on that and said, okay, I want a severance. I don't want a speedy trial. But the law in Georgia, as in most states, is that one defendant can't cherry pick a trial date to the exclusion of the others. You're supposed to try everyone in a conspiracy or enterprise together. So even though that defendant's asking for a speedy trial, the judge can look at that and say, I'm not going to grant that because the public policy issues are such that we need to try all of you together, and that trial won't be for several months, if not another year.
Curtis, that is one of the questions I think for a lot of people is, hey, 19 defendants, and you just talked about the part of the case, 161 different incidents that prove, at least from the prosecutor's view, all of these different things are going to happen. It seems like it's so complex. Would it be more complex to try and put them on trial all together at the same time?
Not really, because the whole theory of the RICO is you've got an enterprise and folks are doing all these things.
And you're seeing some of the mugshots of the people who have turned themselves in today, by the way. Those are not all of the defendants in the case, but those are the ones who have turned themselves in so far, and we've got mugshots for them.
Notice Jenna Willis's mugshot over there on the far left-hand corner. She was one of former President Trump's lawyers, and she is smiling so broadly she's almost laughing. And unlike the other defendants, she has publicized her own mugshot on social media, and she included with it a quote from Psalms, "Shout for joy, all you who are upright in heart." And of course, she's called the charges unfair and politically motivated. So each one of these mugshots, there are two. David Schaefer also is smiling, whereas Rudy Giuliani has a very serious expression on his face. I mean, it's fascinating. Even they don't agree on how they should look in their mugshots, Curtis. And of course, we don't have the mugshot that everybody's waiting to see.
Sure. Yeah, it's very little to be smiling about, but Kent, back to your question, you're asking about the complexity. This, 98-page indictment comes with a table of contents, and it is a roadmap to the case. So the jury will get to read it, the prosecutor will use that roadmap, and the person in court that tells the best story is the one that wins. And if that story goes from A to Z, in this case through 161 predicate acts, and that's all explained to the jury, and the proof, of course, is laid out here, at the end of the day, the jury has a perfect understanding of what the cases are, so it's really not that complicated.
What, in your view, what is the difficulty of trying to put this case together? Is it connecting all those predicate acts with these 19 defendants? What do we think we're going to see once we get to that point in a trial?
I've heard other folks say that RICO's complicated. I don't think it is. RICO is just a convenient way of talking about what a group of people do to try to commit a crime. And if you explain it to the jury, as they do in 98 pages plus the table of contents, that's easy to explain. 19 defendants is cumbersome in the courtroom. I've tried cases that had 32 defendants. It's a little cumbersome, but you're going to have the prosecutor, they already know their case. They're ready to try it probably today. All they have to do is go through each of those predicate acts, put the witnesses on, the documents on that prove that, and march their way through the case until they get to the end. It won't be that hard for the prosecution, and the jury should be able to follow it.
The challenge of a political crime is difficult for the general public, for the average person, to grasp a political crime, unless you're talking about something like bribery, money under the table to the elected official, or something like that, cheating. These crimes, I think, are difficult for the average person to comprehend, to say, oh yeah, that was a crime, unless of course you're prejudiced against these people, against these Republicans.
Tom, I'm going to disagree with you.
Oh really?
I will, yes, because every one of them are state crimes. Are they as sexy, so to speak, as...
But they're crimes that people haven't ever heard of before.
Well, not necessarily. Intimidate the witness. When you bring a witness in and tell her to change her testimony and lie, that's perjury, that's suborning perjury. That we know about that. When you have a false document that says I'm an elector when I'm not, that's not too complicated to figure out. When you submit those false elector statements to the Senate, that's pretty obvious. And of course, in the backdrop of all that is this image of our Capitol being attacked by folks that are trying to challenge the election. So that's going to haunt these defendants, because ultimately the result of that was this ultimate attack on our democracy.
But remember though, Curtis, you've got people out there, for example, who are saying that it was a tourist visit to Capitol Hill, okay? And Mr. Trump's new lawyer, just fresh attorney today, Mr. Sadow, said in a statement, quote, "Mr. Trump should never have been indicted. He is innocent of all the charges." Of course, all lawyers say that. "Prosecutions intended to advance or serve the ambitions and careers of political opponents of the president have no place in our justice system." And he didn't issue this statement by accident. He's trying to influence prospective jurors, correct?
Of course, but ultimately a jury the jurors are gonna see this evidence and they get to decide, was that a crime or not? And there aren't too many folks that would look at what happened to the Capitol and think that's, you know, a tourist visit, you know, those. And you've got the gallows out front trying to hang Mike Pence. They had to hide out so they wouldn't get hurt. People got injured in the attack, so those are all problems.
We're showing you the jail records right now, and this indicates that he has been released. It says that Donald Trump has been booked and now has been released. So apparently the process is moving pretty quickly, at least what the electronics tell us today.
So the next picture we should see is the motorcade leaving the jail compound. Just speculating on the pictures we should be seeing.
You know, and we referenced a moment ago, in speaking with you, Curtis, you referenced January 6th and all of that. So this is the fourth time that Mr. Trump has been charged with crime. So just quickly, the first back in March, that's when the Manhattan District Attorney announced 34 counts against him. That was a case involving falsified business records, also connection with hush money payments to Stormy Daniels during the 2016 election. That case currently scheduled for trial in March. And then in early June, federal prosecutors charged Mr. Trump with illegally holding classified documents from his presidency at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach. Prosecutors added additional charges in late July, so that made a total of 40 counts against Mr. Trump. In that case, the trial in the documents case, that's set for May as of right now, and then soon after August 1st. So this month, federal prosecutors charging the former president in Washington 4 counts related to the January 6th, 2021 attack on the Capitol during the certification of the 2020 presidential election. A judge expected to set the date for that trial this coming Monday. And just to kind of button this all up, prosecutors want that to begin in January. The defense wants it delayed until April 2026. So finally, August 14th is when the Fulton County District Attorney announced the indictment in this Georgia election case, 13 charges against the former president. So in all, across all 4 cases, he's facing 91 criminal charges.
Which case do you think holds the greatest legal peril for the former president of the United States?
Some people think that the documents case is that strongest case because there's so much evidence of consciousness of guilt, moving documents around, telling people to lie, trying to destroy tapes. There's strong proof there. If you look at what is the case that might get the most concern of the jury, if the jury has some concern about our democracy, then the federal election fraud case and now this Georgia case would certainly be at the top of the list. And the Georgia case is such a compelling roadmap, as is the federal election fraud case. So both of those are very strong cases. His jeopardy in all those cases is very strong. And I can't imagine he's sleeping well at night running the gauntlet of all of these 4 different cases.
That was one of the things that we discussed briefly before coming on air. 4 different cases all at the same time. That has to be a lot of pressure, even if you're Donald Trump or the former president and you feel like you're Teflon and nothing sticks to you.
You can put on a happy face, but no sane lawyer would tell him that he's not in jeopardy with 4 different cases. And again, it's not like they're hiding the ball on the proof. The federal case laid it out in great detail. Now the Georgia case does the same thing. And they spent 2 years investigating. They got the witnesses buttoned down. You know, they'll be able to roll into court with that proof and the documents. And it's a tough roadmap for the president, former president, to defeat.
Mr. Trump does have a track record of changing attorneys a lot, and just today he changed attorneys again and brought in this Mr. Sadow. Do you know anything about him? Have you ever heard of him?
Never heard of him. They say he's a well respected lawyer up there, and he may well be, but the fact that you change, he's had a defense team trying to talk the Georgia folks out of that indictment. They tried to talk the feds out of the indictment. Obviously, it's unsuccessful. Mr. Trump can't be happy with that. That's one reason to fire a lawyer. You think they're not being successful, probably not for lack of trying. But when you shuffle your lead counsel out the day you're walking into court, obviously that indicates there's some dissension. He's lost 4 lawyers in the last, month or so that were on his team for a long period of time. So that's another headache for him.
We will we'll continue monitoring this, and we'll pop up video here, but you're seeing different live shots that were shown. I do want to show you earlier today, all day, the former president's impending surrender had drawn crowds to the jail. And so we've seen supporters gathering. They've been holding various signs, flags, showing their support for Mr. Trump. And this event, it's also drawn a protest of sorts at that county courthouse, which is just a few miles away from the jail. Few people showed up in rat costumes. They say represent a group that they call Republicans Against Trump. That acronym, of course, being RAT. Lots of folks paying attention here. Certainly the president has his opponents, but he's got so many supporters who want to be around him and involved and show their support. So we're not sure how much longer it's going to take there, but we'll stay with you, of course. And again, we're watching these live shots, the overhead shots that we're seeing there as we see what happens with the motorcade when he eventually departs, and we expect that he'll be heading back to New Jersey tonight.
Kent, one of the things we saw was a poster that says Trump or death, which of course is part of the thing that you worry about because there's death threats out there for the judge and the prosecutors and witnesses. So that's the kind of stuff that obviously Mr. Trump can't control who puts a poster out there, but to the extent that some of his social media promotes that type of mission or message, you know, that's going to get him in trouble, Tom. Back to those bond conditions.
Yeah.
You know, that is the kind of stuff where he'd be crossing the line if he encourages that type of misconduct.
I got a chance to do an interview this week with Georgia, U.S. representative from Georgia, Buddy Carter. I asked Representative Carter if he sees a difference between people like Stacey Abrams questioning the integrity of an election and then taking steps to coerce or intimidate election officials like Mr. Trump's phone call to Brad Raffensperger.
Well, they're different, but then again, they're the same thing. Both of them were protesting the election, and both of them were questioning the results of the election. But what's the difference? One of them turned it into an indictment, and another one didn't. But everyone has the right to question that. We have freedom of speech here in America, so this will play out in the courts, and we'll see what will happen. And I'm one who believes that justice will prevail.
So, Curtis, I know you couldn't hear what the congressman was saying right there, but he said everyone has a right to question it. We got a freedom of speech here. And in his view, there's no difference between what's being alleged here and what previous candidates have done to say, hey, I question the results of that election. There is a difference, right?
Sure. I mean, that'll clearly be a theme for the defense. But, you know, free speech has its limits. For example, you can't cry fire in a theater. So free speech doesn't allow you to solicit folks to sign false documents and say they're electors when they're not, to try to intimidate witnesses, to ask public officials to violate their oath of office. So those are all crimes that cross the line, and they're the predicate acts in this indictment.
The motorcade is on their way out of the Fulton County Jail complex, on their way back to Atlanta Airport, and Mr. Trump will board his plane and fly back to Newark, New Jersey, and return to Bedminster.
There's nothing scheduled, but we've seen at least one other of these instances where Mr. Trump at the airport on his departure took a moment to address reporters and whatever. So we'll try and see if that's going to happen tonight. But 6 different vehicles in the motorcade, plus all those motorcycles that you saw as well. Should be 15 minutes or more between the jail and going back to Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport.
Tell me about your history. Tell our viewers about your history of prosecuting RICO acts trials.
Sure, Tom. I've handled RICO. They don't use it very often in federal court, but I've prosecuted multi-defendant RICO cases, and it runs the gauntlet. Mr. Giuliani talks about using it against the mafia. That's true, but it can be used in all manner of things. Ms. Willis has used it in a variety of matters, you know, briberies with teachers and whatnot. I used it once upon a time in a copyright infringement case where folks were out making cassettes, falsely producing them, and then selling them at flea markets and whatnot. So they're kind of, you know, cheating from the artists and the recording artists. So it can be applied to a wide variety of an enterprise that's engaged in a criminal act, as long as there's a group of individuals do it. And it's really not a lot different than a conspiracy. You know, we know what a conspiracy is: an agreement by 2 or more people to commit an illegal act. The RICO is just kind of a supercharged conspiracy because you can have multiple acts that they're attempting to violate within the predicate act structure of the RICO agreement.
And it's the most serious crime in this Georgia case, and it's the #1 crime, isn't it?
It's RICO's is typically the more serious. And of course, you can have a variety of predicate acts. You could have murders, you could have robberies, but here is different state crimes that we've talked about, and they are all embraced with a very broad reaching RICO statute, whether it be state or federal court.
$80,000 of his $200,000 bond is just for the RICO charge, and then there's $10,000 for each of the 12 remaining charges. So that just said to me, wow, you know, that's the most serious one.
Sure, the judge would see that as the most serious, and typically that's how bonds are published, is based on the serious nature of the charge.
Now, he had to post $20,000, right, 10%?
If he used a bondsman.
He might have just put the whole money up.
He could have brought a cashier's check in. I would.
He does have it, from
Sure.
what we know.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to do it. You can, and I don't think they required any collateral, so he could put it up with the sheriff's office and let him hold it until the case is over.
So 19 defendants in this specific case. You said you prosecuted a case with more than 30 defendants. Give us an idea of what this looks like if once it gets to trial, if it does, because it seems like you've got to make some accommodations to have that many defendants and their attorneys.
You've got to have a big courtroom. Now, there may not be 19 by the time the case is tried, right? There could be folks that cooperate and plea, so that may be a smaller number, but even 10, that's a big number. So you got to have a good-sized courtroom because you got to have multiple counsel tables for the defendants and their lawyers, and some will have multiple lawyers. Mr. Trump will surely have a team of lawyers there. So yeah, the logistics on that are somewhat complicated. But again, that's the art of the judge keeping track of the courtroom and, all right, call your next witness. And the witness is up there. All those lawyers get to cross-examine that witness. But the prosecutor goes first. They have the case in chief, and they'll go walk through their indictment with each of those chapters and put the evidence on. And it'll be methodical, and what'll happen is some of those lawyers are going to step on each other's toes, because you can't have 19 lawyers in a courtroom, or however many there are, without some of them getting off the reservation and going a direction that the other lawyer, oh my gosh, why'd you ask that question? I wish you hadn't. So
because each of the lawyers is trying to defend their own individual client.
Right, and some of them might take the strategy of throwing Mr. Trump under the bus and saying, well, they did it because of Mr. Trump. We've seen a lot of, there's 1,000 defendants at the Capitol that have been prosecuted. A lot of them have said, I did it because I did it on behalf of Mr. Trump. I was following the orders of the president. Some of these defendants in this case may have the same strategy.
Are attorneys in a case like that, are they allowed to speak to each other or put together their strategy in tandem with another counsel?
Absolutely. They can have what's called a joint defense agreement. They can do it in writing, they can do it verbally. And that joint defense agreement says, we're going to coordinate. We're going to try to make sure we don't step on each other's toes. We're going to try to beat the prosecutor. But that's difficult to do when you've got so many different competing interests with 19 different defendants, different roles they played, different agendas. So it's not going to be an easy thing for the defense attorneys to keep their common strategy together.
Yeah. Well, we, again, will continue monitoring this, but we are going to take a moment and wrap this up and say goodbye.
And we'll have full coverage tonight on the 10 o'clock news. And of course, if Mr. Trump says something, we'll have that on tonight on the 10 o'clock news.
Yeah, thank you for joining us for the special coverage of former President Donald Trump's surrender at the Fulton County Jail following his indictment of the 2020 Georgia election case.
We will have a complete wrap up later on the 10 o'clock news. And again at 11, we're now going to return you to our regular programming. Thank you, Curtis.
My pleasure, Tom. Kent.
Stay with the local station on TV, on the go, and online at newsportjax.com for new developments on this breaking news alert.